Hey, welcome back to Module 2 in your short course on how to speed up concussion recovery. So in this module, we are going to talk about what the concussion brain pattern involves so that you can understand what is happening in the brain to cause the symptoms of concussion. On this first image is an example of what happens to a brain when it sustains a concussion. So you can see here, there's two kiddos who are knocking heads, and the point of injury is here in the frontal lobe. So as the brain strikes the other person's head, and you can read it here for yourself, but I'm going to describe it differently. What happens is the brain slams up against the front of the skull, and in doing so, it creates a whiplash type of motion, and it can create physical damage, which is explained on the slide, but it also involves functional damage. So as the head hits the other person's head, there's damage at the front of the brain. That's called the coup injury, C-O-U-P, coup injury. Now, as the kiddo falls back, you can see now the brain is moving in the direction of the back of the head. And it moves forward also. So by the time this kiddo falls, without even hitting the ground, the brain has already slammed up against the back of the head. This injury is called the contra-coup injury. So when people sustain a concussion, most times there's two areas of injury. At the site where they were actually hit in the head, and at the opposite pole in their brain where the brain slammed up against the skull as it was moving in the opposite direction. Many times that is the more involved injury. So now breaking it down, like I've already started to talk about, there's physical injury where the cells are actually injured, like you can read, but there's also functional injury, which means that the brain no longer uses speed, processing speed, remembering from our earlier module, it no longer uses speed in the way that it's supposed to. Now the power is knocked low and the brain is going too slow. And we're going to look at that together. First, let's look at some concussion signs. Signs are dizziness, nausea, headaches, light sensitivity, and confusion. Now, my question for you is, why do you think these are the signs? It's because the brain is no longer working properly. Yes, it's due to the initial physical damage, but these symptoms can continue long after the brain's physical aspect has healed because it has a functional injury. And so it's just like if you hurt your leg and you never have it, if you break your leg and you never have it x-rayed and have a cast put on it and it heals itself, it can heal itself improperly and you will consistently have a problem with your leg. That is what happens in concussion when you don't have a QEEG brain map to know what's going on in there and you don't have neurofeedback training, which is the only thing that can improve the way that the brain uses speed. Okay, so this is what a QEEG brain map brain pattern of a concussion looks like. There's low absolute power because when the brain sustains the injury, the power is knocked low. An analogy I like to use is if you have the controller of your TV, if the battery is running low, sometimes it will turn the channel and sometimes it will not. Sometimes it will raise or lower the volume, sometimes it will not. That's because the power in the battery is too low. The same thing happens in the brain. That's why there's confusion. That's why there's nausea, because your brain runs your entire body. So if your brain is not running your body well, that's when sickness, the symptoms of nausea and sickness are felt. That is why there's sensitivity to auditory and light, because the brain is not processing sensory information in real time. It's knocked low and then slow. You can see at the bottom, delta and theta are running too high. We know that because it's red and yellow on the brain map. That brain is running in sleep and fall asleep mode. And that is what creates the symptoms. Okay, so moving on, when concussion symptoms persist for more than a few weeks, that's when it becomes post-concussive syndrome. So the old adage was to go home and wait for the brain to heal itself. We now know through science that some brains never heal themselves. So yes, time can sometimes help people, but most times a small amount of time can help people. And as time passes beyond that, beyond the acute phase, then a person begins to use the worsened concussive brain pattern. And as we start to use a brain pattern, it starts to wire itself in. So the magic, the key, is to create a new, better brain pattern, heal your brain to how it was performing before the injury, so that it will begin to use that new, better brain pattern, so that the post-concussive syndrome brain pattern never sets in and hardwires itself in. Because if you just keep using the concussion brain pattern, your brain functioning will be impacted over the long haul with long-term terrible effects that are shown by science. So post-concussion syndrome, headaches, dizziness, sleep problems, appetite changes, fatigue, feeling tired all the time, difficulty concentrating with memory, depression or anxiety. I'm going to come back to this in just a second, and sensitivity to light and sound. So coming back to depression and anxiety, as we use these brain patterns, the negative brain patterns, if we don't change them and create an upward spiral, what happens is new brain patterns will set in. They develop, brain patterns will develop into other brain patterns. And we know, again, through the science, that a head injury brain pattern can develop into mental health challenges. Don't believe me? I've probably already told you this, but go to the Boston University Center for CTE, chronic traumatic encephalitis, which is what happens to brains when they have sustained multiple concussions. And what has been found in posthumously after death for all of the professional football players who have died knowing they had multiple concussions, many of them, most of them, basically all of them, but it's not totally proven, all of them died with mental health challenges, depression and anxiety, namely. Go check that out. It's fascinating. And I do live workshops on the topic because I find it to be just absolutely fascinating. But it's fascinating in the sense that we need to back this concussion pattern out so that you or your loved one do not suffer from mental health challenges. And the way that it happened with those football players is that they had concussions when they played professional football, and then it's 5, 10, 15 years later and they have mental health issues, and nobody's attributing it to the concussions of 10 years ago. But the reality is we know that that concussion pattern develops into depression and anxiety and a whole bunch of other terrible mental health issues. So they are directly linked scientifically. Okay, so the post-concussive syndrome brain is too much slow brain processing speed, too little power across the board, and high delta and theta is that too much slow speed. Basically, the brain is stuck in low and slow gear, and that creates the symptoms that we've already talked about. Okay, so how do we optimize a concussion brain pattern? We have to increase power. We have to decrease all that slowness in the brain. We need to make sure that that brain doesn't kick it into overdrive using excessive fast speed, because then that creates anxiety over time of a low and slow brain that needs to kick it into overdrive so that that person can go back to their life and try to perform. And we need to make sure that perfect processing speed of alpha is being used so that low motivation doesn't set in. And if it does, we need to speed the brain up to get motivation back on board and avoid depression. Okay, up next, how you can rewire your brain to become healthy again using neuroplasticity. So follow me through to the next lesson, and I'll see you there.